This episode is brought to you by Saga Fitness, the creators of the world's first wireless automated training cuffs. Their BFR cuffs leverage the benefits of blood flow restriction, which is not as scary as it sounds if you're a member of the uninitiated, to reduce the time and intensity required to build muscle, increase strength, or come back from injury. Listen, at the end of the day, and all the science aside, this is a way to help you work out more efficiently. And they're the first ones that allow you to really calibrate it to your individual needs. In the past, people were just guessing or buying really expensive equipment. Saga has ended the need for that. And most importantly, you guys will get a 20% discount when you use the code BRETT20. Again, that's BRETT20 at saga.fitness. Make sure to check them out. They make it a great travel companion. Welcome to the Art of Coaching Podcast, a show aimed at getting to the core of what it takes to change attitudes, behaviors, and outcomes in the weight room, boardroom, classroom, and everywhere in between. I'm your host, Brett Bartholomew. I'm a performance coach, keynote speaker, and the author of the book, Conscious Coaching. But most importantly, I'm a lifelong student interested in all aspects of human behavior and communication. I want to thank you for joining me, and now let's dive into today's episode. There's a lot of things we don't like to talk about when it comes to leadership and coaching and day-to-day life. The ugly realities, the things that make us cringe when we hear about them on the news. But these are also the same things that we're going to have to face. It's a reality. And these are things including psychological abuse, sexual abuse in leadership and coaching. And I can think of nobody better to talk about some of this stuff today than our guest, Christina Myers. Now, listen, I get it. It can be easy to want to fast forward, check out another episode that talks about a topic that's not so cringeworthy. But you're going to have to deal with these things if you want to lead long term. You're going to work with people who have to overcome a wide variety of struggles. And in today's society, it's not hard to turn on the news and hear yet another story about somebody in power doing something that they shouldn't. We also talk a lot about the male-female dynamic in competitive environments. And though we've touched on some of these points in prior episodes, we've never quite touched on it like this. We've never quite touched on the fact that what's it like to be a female coach in a male-dominated field when you're going to be treated differently. You're going to be constantly asked to be somebody you're not. You're going to be discredited, or you're going to be asked to prove yourself constantly. And these are the things that Christina unearths and unpacks so well. She owns a private sector strength and conditioning company and serves as both the head strength coach and the head coach of the high-level competitive gymnastics program in Birmingham, Alabama. She, like myself, took a non-traditional route into strength and conditioning, and she uses this experience to mentor undergraduates and young coaches in the field. She holds a master's degree in strength and conditioning, applied exercise science, and regularly guest lectures for undergraduate and graduate programs catering to coaches. Now, with every episode, especially if you're a new listener, understand that our goal with this podcast is to interview people from a wide variety of fields and how they're handling some of these issues. So you don't have to be a strength coach. And I hope that if you're somebody that's not a strength coach, you still share this within your organization, because it's the stories we hear about other people from other places and other professions and other cultures that sometimes can teach us the most about ourselves and our own. I hope you enjoy this episode. And I can't thank our sponsors enough, Momentous and Saga Fitness and VersaClimber, for allowing us to bring this type of content to you guys on a regular basis. Please, 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 if this has helped you in any way, make sure to leave a review and subscribe, because we have many more great conversations like this coming down the road. But for now, enjoy Christina Myers. Hey guys, thanks so much for sitting down with me for another conversation. I am here with Christina Myers. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's nice to see you again. It's been a while since you joined us at the very first pilot apprenticeship that we did.
Yes, that was November.
Yeah.
Before COVID.
Yeah. It's hard to think of that time before COVID, right? Like it seems all like a blur. But you to this day, I continue to tell people like you opened that up so much in terms of being just willing to break down, be transparent, and get right to it. That wasn't an easy thing, was it?
No, not at all.
And so now you get to do a second variation of that. Our audience has a little idea about your background through listening, but give us an idea of like, what's today like? What's a day-to-day, day in the life for you like with everything that you manage with you and that you balance?
So I typically am kind of divided up, mornings being specifically strength and conditioning work, and then afternoons being a lot of gymnastics. So most mornings I have a couple of clients on my own, kind of in my private sector stuff, starting around 5:30 or 6. And then usually I will go in and do an hour or 2 hours of gymnastics specific strength and conditioning over at the gym that I work at, gymnastics gym that I work at. And then I either am doing my own training, working on my computer, doing program updates, or, putting together lectures for things, just answering emails, that kind of stuff. And then around 3:00 every day, so basically when school gets out, I go back in for gymnastics, and I'm there until 8 or 9 o'clock almost every night. And it generally starts with strength and conditioning stuff. So I'll have a whole bunch of groups that kind of run through that first hour to 2 hours of the practice time for that. And then the rest of it is strictly gymnastics. So actually coaching as competitive teams.
And that's a perfect example of why I wanted to get to that, because you do so much context switching throughout the day, right? And we've had a lot of diverse guests on, but none that have a background in gymnastics. And that lends itself, people that do gymnastics, to a certain personality type. Now, of course, they're not monoliths and anything like that. But just in case some of our listeners are not, let's say, initiated into the world of competitive gymnastics, can you give an idea of kind of what those personality types are like? What kind of person gets into highly competitive gymnastics? Are these perfectionists by nature? And I'm saying that with a smile on my face.
Yes, definitely. So I will say it's starting to change a little bit. The culture of gymnastics is having some much needed changes forward in a better direction, but it still is a really kind of a almost a stereotypical kind of person really gets into it and makes it to the highest levels. And that is that perfectionist type. It tends to be, I don't want to say they're all introverted, because there are some that are not and that are a little bit louder, but they do tend to be kind of that self-disciplined, really academically driven kind of person. And I mean, if you look at like at the college level and what gymnastics teams and their GPAs are like, you have like the entire team has a GPA of 3.85 or above at the college level, which is just crazy for a sports team. And you'll see that even in the high school age. Like I have 2 seniors graduating. One of them's valedictorian at her school, and the other one's GPA is like a 4.5 something. And they're both in the gym, tons of hours during the week doing gymnastics, and they're still just absolutely blowing it away at school. So I'd say that personality type really is successful in gymnastics and has been historically and continues to be, because it is such a detail-oriented sport. And it's such a mental sport. I mean, all sports are, but not every sport requires you to be doing flips on a 4-inch beam and some of these kinds of things. So I think more than any other sport, there's such a huge mental component to it. And if you don't have that, there's only so much coaching of it that you can do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, without a question. I think anybody listening, whether they coach for a living in a sports context or anything else, can relate to the fact that there's people that we try to guide that are inherently very highly perfectionistic, right? They're very analytical. They're in their own heads. We have a coaching client right now that it's a business owner that is trying to enhance the way they communicate because they're trying to scale, and they're very type A, right? So one area that I struggle with, even though that I consider this somewhat of my expertise, is they came in and our first call, they want a lot of information. I want to be a better communicator. I need to do this. They want checklists. They want everything under the sun. And what was tricky for me is I'm thinking, all right, you want to avoid the curse of knowledge. So I think, well, what are you already familiar with of ours? And they really hadn't gone through much of our stuff, right? But they wanted this whole breakdown of how they could be better. And I asked them, well, where are you right now as a communicator? Like, what are you doing right now? How do you see yourself now? And they said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, very clearly, like, you're trying to communicate with other folks. How have you analyzed your own style? And all they could really say is, I'm type A, I'm analytical. And when I try helping them get an idea that information alone while it might help them, isn't going to build that skill for them to help others. That was hard for them to swallow. Do you feel like you ever struggle with that when you're trying to appeal to this highly analytical group, but at some point you still have to diversify that? Like, how do you struggle, if at all, as somebody that identified, right? You have a gymnastics background, or somebody that's trying to communicate with that population now?
I think exactly what you just said, information. And, I love school. I've always loved school and information and formal education and that kind of thing. So for me, coming out of that exact same personality type that I just described that most gymnasts are, and the coaching style that I came up under was very much you listen and you don't speak and you do what you're told. And not really a very interactive or two-sided thing. And so I think I learned from that, and that I don't ever want to coach that way. And I learned that that's not right. But at the same time, when I was first getting into coaching, that was all I really knew, because that was the majority of my coaching history for myself, coming from about 3 years old up until I was 17, when I finally left the sport of gymnastics and moved on to something else in a serious capacity. And so it took a long time to kind of unlearn that, even though I knew when I first started coaching gymnastics myself that I didn't want to coach the same way my old coaches had. I still didn't have anything else to go off of, really. And so I'd say now I try to, one, make sure that I'm not doing the same thing to the girls that I'm coaching. And it really is a matter of getting to know each kid and what is going to work for them and what gets through to them. And then being able to kind of change the way that you are coaching them, both like technical corrections and that kind of stuff, and just the way you interact with them. Like, some kids I can be sarcastic with and they think it's funny and they're going to get those jokes, and some kids aren't going to get it. And so if I tell them no and I'm really kidding, they're going to take me literally, and they're going to walk away and think I really just told them no. And so kind of getting to know each human, individually, but then also getting to know their actual technical proficiency in the sport. And then even on an intellectual level, I have never worked with a kid who's not smart, not in gymnastics, not at high levels, but they don't learn the same way. And so for some of them, I can just say, do this, and they're going to be like, okay, and be able to do it. And some of them, I need to draw them a picture on a whiteboard, which I've done, or I need to video them and show it to them and go, okay, this is what I'm talking about. Now try this. And they don't, you've got to really get in and do it differently for each kid. And that can be hard. And we talked about how I shift gears a lot during the day. So while I'm coaching gymnastics, in a single 6-hour span, I'll go from high school seniors down to 8-year-olds back to like the high school group. And so you just have to keep changing, because obviously I don't talk to my 8-year-olds or give them the same level of detail and correction that I can with one of my older kids who's really going to get it and who actually understands what their body is doing and will be able to put those things into place. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Valid point. I appreciate the detail. I think the interesting thing is a lot of people will say, hey, obviously I shouldn't talk to this person the way that I do that person. But I think if they saw themselves on tape or listened to themselves, they'd be surprised at how much they really did, and I'm included in that as well. And I think, one of our listeners had a great question one time around this idea of working with highly analytical, perfectionistic folks, people that we really consider like this technician archetype. They asked, how do you keep them from engaging in self-destructive behaviors, whether that is, really awful self-talk, which I know I have, it's something I always struggle with, right? I have this like shadow figure that incessantly rips up my work. Now I've gotten to make peace with them over the years a little bit periodically. But we know that can take many manifestations in an athlete or any individual's life. How do you approach that? If there's anybody that you've ever worked with, and of course, respecting their privacy, not asking to name names, but have you ever had somebody that just, it starts to get very toxic with how they talk to themselves and get in their own head and become self-destructive?
I would say, honestly, the majority of the people that I work with, specifically in gymnastics, that's the way they are. And they're young, for one, so they're really just in those formative years. And so if we don't get them out of that now, it's gonna follow them forever. But it's the perfectionist personality that we just talked about. Plus, we've got an aesthetic sport that's very detail oriented, that does require a lot of feedback back and forth between the coach and the gymnast. So like almost every single thing that they do, I'm going to have to give them a correction, a cue, a something. And so on my end, just with technical corrections and that kind of thing, I have to make sure that I'm always telling them what they're doing well before I'm telling them what they're doing wrong or what they can work on. And I think it goes a long way for me to not say, you did this well, but you did this wrong, but to say, you did this well, let's work on this next, so that it's always framed in a positive light. Because just like I did it as a kid and even can still do it to myself a little bit now, if I say, you ran really fast, but your arms were bent, all they hear is your arms were bent. Like they didn't hear you did this part right at the beginning. So I think definitely making sure that each actual correction that we give is kind of framed in a positive light and is something that is constructive feedback and not just like a criticism, like you did this wrong, but also in the way that you interact with them. Again, kind of going back to that, sometimes I don't talk to them. I just listen to what they're saying when they think I'm not paying attention.
Yeah.
And hearing the way they either talk to each other about themselves or just kind of, sometimes kids are funny. They like talk to themselves. So they really will be talking to themselves, but I'll hear them say negative things about themselves. Whether it's body image, especially working with these young girls and they're in a leotard all the time. Whether it's something that's going on at school that they might not have come to me with, but they'll tell their friends, they've got somebody being mean to them there. They have something going on at school that's making them feel like they don't fit in, like they aren't good enough for some reason. And that kind of stuff just starts following them into sport as well. So if they're dealing with that at school and then they're coming straight to the gym and all I'm doing or all any other coach is doing is telling them what to fix, all they hear is, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good enough. And they never hear anything that's going to help build their confidence up. And especially working with younger girls, and I think with anybody, because I definitely do this with my adults too, but I say, especially if you've got younger girls, they're already tearing themselves down, especially when they're hitting those teenage years. So anything you can do to kind of reverse that narrative in their head and start building up confidence in them is going to go such a long way. And how they talk to themselves, like you mentioned, and eventually how they talk to other people, I think, and how they perform at work and that kind of thing, because they're going to have the confidence to, one, actually, have some confidence in what they're doing and that they're doing a good job and that they are good enough as they are, but in not seeing other people as competition, because they're going to not feel like they have to bring other people down in order for themselves to be successful. And that just makes such a big difference in the actual dynamic and your relationships with other people later on.
Yeah, some great touch points there. One that I want to get into is, I'm glad that you talked about this idea of, sometimes you won't say anything. You'll just kind of listen and observe to see what they say to themselves, when you're not actively coaching. And the reason I say that is we have this idea that management, leadership, coaching always has to be this incredibly active process. Our hands have to be on everything. We have to shape it. We have to give feedback constantly, right? We have this idea that if you're not doing this, and this really builds into how a lot of ourselves, this idleness aversion, right? If you're a leader of any kind, you don't want to be idle. You want to make an impact at any way you can. But it can't always be this highly active process. You do have to step back. You have to observe. You have to go through this guided discovery. Was there ever a point where that was hard for you, where you felt like, no, I constantly want to be involved. I want to be a fixer. I want to do this. And if so, when was it that you realized, like, Christina, at some point you've got to just like, the indirect is the direct?
I think you mentioned being a fixer, and I am very much a person who, like, if you want something done right, you need to do it yourself. And if I see something that could be done more efficiently, even if sometimes it's not really my business, I want to fix it. Like, I just want to come in and completely revamp the whole thing, redo the system, whatever it is, and make sure that it's being done the right way. And sometimes it's not my thing to stick my hands in. And I have to remind myself of that the way someone else is coaching is not really my business. As long as it's not, abusive or going to harm somebody, then it's not my place to get in the middle of that. And that is a hard thing because it is my personality type. Even though I'm a little bit more kind of an introspective, a little bit introverted person, I have a really hard time watching things not be done the way I would do them and not wanting to do something about it. And it kind of goes back to that perfectionist mentality, I think. And I have to be really careful when that happens, because sometimes I will consciously know that I shouldn't get involved and so I won't, but I'll catch myself still thinking about it and watching something happen or an interaction between other people and thinking, well, I would do it this way. And I have to go get out of it. You're not involved. So literally don't be involved. Don't waste your mental space, because then it just makes me, kind of resentful or even just kind of walking into the building already annoyed, even though there's literally nothing for me to be worried about. And so then that affects how I talk and what my mood is when I'm walking into work. So I think really just trying to figure out how to let that stuff go. And I will say the older I've gotten, the better I've gotten at doing it, but I still catch myself sometimes and have to just like think through it and go, stop,
Yeah.
get out of it.
Well, and I think just to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, and we're definitely going to get into, you have such a unique perspective and strong expertise in guiding how we should coach female athletes, how we should think about these kinds of things, broader picture. But I do have to ask one selfish question first that deals with that perfectionism. How in the hell did you deal and cope with the thing like the apprenticeship then when we brought you in and made you do improv, and you guys were at the very first like test iteration, right? So we've changed it a lot, but like we threw a lot at you guys, very goofy stuff, some very serious stuff, what have you. But how did that perfectionist in you, that introvert as you identified as within you, take to this situation where now we're doing role-playing games? Like how did that impact you? And more importantly, what made you get over the hump to say, yeah, this is something I'm going to go to? Wouldn't that terrify most introverts?
It did. And it definitely did. And even in the moment of doing it, it is hard because I still like anything that I was going to come up with in my head, even though the entire point was just to kind of be off the cuff and say what first came to you, was I was going to think about 3 different answers and try and give the one that I thought was the best one or that other people wanted to hear. And so I don't know that I've totally overcome that, but I do think it is, again, a little bit about kind of not caring what people think. And even though I would consider myself to be a person who doesn't care what people think, like I've always been a little bit outside the box, like my entire life, and not really feeling like I needed to fit into a specific group. I definitely think when it comes to career-based stuff, I really want to be successful so much that I'm like, okay, if I say that one wrong thing, or trip over that one word, then that's something that people are going to judge me for and be like, well, maybe she's not as smart as, she pretends like she is. And so I think the thing that helps me the most with it is knowing how much I don't care when other people do those things. Like if somebody stutters twice when they're trying to give a talk, like I don't remember that. I remember their main message. And so kind of reminding myself of things like that. And in also having good friends who remind me of things like that, because I do still get nervous or anxious about things. And someone else will be like, but you always do such a good job. So why are you worried? Because you're worried about all these things that never actually happen. And I think that's just what anxiety is. But having people remind me of that and then being able to remind myself is just, I think, huge, and kind of overcoming that and being able to relax a little bit, because really that's what it comes down to, is just saying the first thing that comes to mind instead of overthinking it and trying to pick out the best answer of the possibilities.
Yeah, it's like that Latin proverb when you mentioned being worried about things that may never happen. It's hope for peace, prepare for war. I find that we do that a lot as well, because whenever you put yourself out there, you're going to have this. But you find that generally, your friends are right. And this too, of course, people will judge you more on the aggregate. There's some, we're very transparent on this. We had an extremely hectic morning. Our little boy's sick. We had some audio issues and whatever. So like the start of this podcast is more fumbled than it usually is for me, right? But like at the end of the day, that's our audience. Our audience is imperfect leaders that I think get a little bit tired of, and I enjoy them, but like listening to the amalgamation of NPR episodes and TED episodes of podcasts that have 15 to 20 people working on them, everything seamless. I had an opportunity once to go on a larger podcast, and I remember I had to fly out to LA. I went to the top floor of this place. I got there, and I'm looking at like a production team. A production team. In the meantime, I'm recording this out of my closet, right? Whatever. And then the 2 hosts weren't even there yet. One of them comes in and he's like petting a small cat like he's a Bond villain. And we go into this soundproof like studio and proceed to do the interview. And I'm just looking around like, so this is what happens, right? And we probably talked for 3 hours, and then these editors consolidated it down to 60 minutes. And my whole point of that diatribe is we judge ourselves based off the externalities of what we see, but we have no idea what goes on there, right? And so even when we do our podcast and somebody's like, hey, you should do this like Rogan does or that, I'm like, yeah, that's not who we are. And that's great. That's not that we don't appreciate that. But, you have to look at the things that you do. And plus, you're very fluent in the words that you choose and very purposeful as well. I want to switch gears a little bit to the way you speak to yourself and brand, because you talked about you're not just doing gymnastics, right? You're in the powerlifting world. And if somebody were to look you up if they look you up on Instagram, go ahead and tell them your Instagram handle. Because there's
yeah, my Instagram handle is Lift Heavy Princess. And that actually started as just the name of a blog that I wrote. And I wasn't going to keep it when I officially went into business. And some branding people talked me into it. I was going to change it. And I was like, what other suggestions do you have for the name of this? Because my biggest concern with it was that guys weren't going to hire me, that I was going to only end up with female athletes because there's princess in the name of it. And my other big concern was that I'm really not a princess personality type. I'm very like laid back, low key, like I drive a truck. I basically never wear makeup. So like the things that you typically associate with like that princess personality type, I'm really not any of those things. And so I had a great person doing my branding and she said, no, you should keep it. And she said, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to make your colors black and red with a little bit of like a pink highlight so that it does still appeal to some of those other, I mean, to both genders and different personality types and that kind of thing. But it fits you and it still keeps that because that name is so catchy and it does get people's attention. So I'm glad that other people talked me into keeping it because I probably wouldn't have. But that's what people know me as. I meet people all the time and they don't know my name, but they know, oh, you're Lift Heavy Princess. And I'm like, yep, that's me. And they're like, you're not really what I thought you would be like. You're pretty low key. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a good thing. And they were right. You know, it is smart. It's much like us. You know, I think early on when we were trying to cross over, you know, we were very big on, we wanted people to understand that we weren't just, you know, weight room people. And so Art of Coaching, we were very cautious and try to be purposeful of making sure that our overall branding didn't make it look like that's all we did, because it's certainly not. You know, at the same time, I didn't want to run from our core demographic, right? Because we have a very strong base of people in performance that are now like, awesome, we see what you're trying to do. You're crossing over, you're taking our lessons into the broader leadership world. So you never want to run from that when you're talking about, hey, we're going to have red and black, but we're going to blend some pink, right? Like you want to be able to lean into that. How do you think, you know, going into this now, this idea of obviously we judge books by its cover, right? And we've talked a lot about in these episodes and other things about how we coach women and how we work with members of different genders and what have you. And this has been a pretty hot topic. And one question that me and a good friend of mine, Scott Livingston, were talking about that I want to get into is, for you, you know, what approaches do male coaches and females in some instances take that might have like this positive intention behind it, but also could be received in a manner that doesn't really help the outcome when they're working with female athletes, right? They may think, hey, I'm trying to do right by this. I think this is the way to go. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, I think so. Physiologically, males and females are not all that different when it comes to training and really even sports performance type things. Good training is going to be good training for either one of them with some small individualizations like you would normally make for any athlete. But I think the mentality is where things really are different, partly in just society and the way that girls are raised versus the way that guys are raised to kind of always be part of sports, whereas girls are not. That's still considered the exception, even though literally 50% of athletes out there are female. But it's still kind of treated as unique and special and the exception to the rule rather than the norm when it's really not any of those things. But I think kind of that, like, not fear-based, but the really disciplinarian approach. And I see that a ton in gymnastics. And even though the sport is trying to get away from it, it still kind of is, I think, the most common kind of coaching technique. But I see that a lot in kind of the high school weight room setting as well, where you have the same strength and conditioning coach who's working with the football team, and then they're going to get the women's sports coming in as well. And they don't really shift gears. They try and coach them the same way they do their guys. And one thing I think that you have to remember about those female athletes, and we kind of touched on this earlier, is they're already going to be a little bit more perfectionist, and not trying to generalize every single female to be the same, but that's just kind of a female characteristic a little bit. And they are, especially in that high school age where guys tend to be in that like peacocking stage and they're getting a little overconfident. Girls are doing the exact opposite. They're starting to feel really self-conscious for the first time, and they're in an unfamiliar environment, usually in the weight room, one where they don't really feel like they belong or have been told that they don't belong there. And so if you are kind of being super authoritarian with them, I think that you're just going to find them shrinking away from that, and they're going to do it. They're going to follow and fit in and be in the line and be what you want them to be, but you're never going to truly develop relationships with those athletes, and be able to reach them as well as you could if you do go ahead and give them that kind of that autonomy, because I think they're a little more mature than the guys are at that age, and they can handle it, and they will thrive in that situation and kind of being able to make their own decisions, obviously with coaches' input, but even little things like choosing the music in the weight room. They may not want to listen to the same thing. Like, you might need to turn on Taylor Swift for them, to really get them into a mental state where they want to lift, because they don't want to be yelled at by the same metal that your guys do. Now, some do. Like, I tend to like that kind of music, but not every single person does. And so I think just really making a point to, one, get to know them individually and kind of what makes them tick, and then also taking the time to figure out how to let them be autonomous in their own way, whatever makes sense in your situation, is a really big one.
Yeah, and I think that's where people still get caught up. You mentioned getting to know them and make them tick. It's something that is we repeat over and over. Many guests repeat over and over. And I think people really want a fancier answer, but that's where they get tripped up. Is coaches not only are not switching gears, they're really not learning what makes somebody tick, because we rush our interactions. Everything we try to systematize, we try to make it super efficient. Another thing I'm glad, and I think you're one of the only ones that did this, that you alluded to, is you stated, like, listen, I get that everybody's different. I'm not trying to overgeneralize in terms of how females are and males are, what have you. But I think it's important, because we say it enough on this show. Of course, everybody's different. Situations and circumstances are unique, but there are commonalities in behavior. There are patterns, right? Birds follow migratory patterns, as do many other animals. Humans, we look at how we move from continent to continent. We do this. This is what archetypical behavior is, right? It is a mold. It doesn't mean people don't break it, but there is a mold. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that that's something that we've maybe gone too far on one side, is we're trying to over specialize to the point where we can't even talk about these topics. And then it doesn't lead to any progress, because now we're not talking about differences between coaching male and female, because we're too scared to say anything about that. Because then somebody's going to say, well, now you're overgeneralizing. And then it's like, all right, then how do we make progress? How do we make progress if we literally can't say anything? And we want to say that there are things that you need to recognize, but hey, everybody's different. Then people just get stuck in their own heads. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right on that. And it's something that I've been talking about a lot here lately, even with just like sports performance research concerning like gender differences and that kind of thing. And overwhelmingly, what we've seen, especially from a physiological standpoint, is that we're a lot more alike than we are different between male and female. But the way things are written and the way that they are presented makes it seem like girls are some alien species that need something completely different, when that's really just not the case. And so even if you pull out like essentials of strength and conditioning, or basically any exercise science or strength and conditioning textbook, you see a chapter or a small section of a chapter that's special populations, and that's where the female athletes are. Like, they're stuck in that special little, they get like a page to themselves or something, when really the entire book is about them, but they've been stuck into this one little small spot, and treated as if they are something different, that they belong in there with the elderly population or with people with disabilities or something like that. And so I think anytime we do that and we treat it like it is some like unique, special, only certain people can do it, or only certain people have these qualities kind of thing, then we're just doing them a disservice, in that we are setting it up where you can't talk about it, where you have to treat it like it's special or like it's some kind of disorder to be female, but that's not the case at all. And again, like I said earlier, they're literally half of the athletes are female at this point. So I don't know why they're still on this one page special section in a textbook, or why I'm still presenting on it as a special topic, which I love to do. I think it needs to be talked about, and I'm going to keep doing it. But if you bring me on as a special topic to talk about female athletes, it makes it seem like only one presentation was worth talking about female athletes, and that kind of thing, rather than like everybody coming into it with the mindset that if you're talking about athletes, you're talking about both, and that they're not different in that aspect, that the training stuff, the performance stuff is the same. And yeah, there's some small stuff that you really had to pay attention to with females. Like I said, the mental stuff, maybe a little bit, making sure that you're really paying attention to ACL injuries, because we know they're more prone to it. But ultimately, 99% is the same. And there's like that 1% difference. And we have to stop treating it like it's some taboo thing.
Yeah, I think it's funny. It's almost like I used to joke we'd go to strength and conditioning conferences. You call yourself a strength and conditioning coach, yet nothing was on coaching and communication. It was all on training, and just like what you're saying is, okay, females are one little special population, and it almost seems like a quota. Hey guys, we're throwing a clinic. Do we have a female speaker? Let's check that box, right? And it's like, no, it's just gotten to be interesting. And that lends itself to the second question I was going to ask you, and you already alluded to it, is, what behaviors are counterproductive, or, what do you think are productive? If, let's say there's a role-playing example right here, let's imagine somebody's listening, they're a bright young coach, leader, manager, what have you, and, they're in charge of a lot of women's sports teams, or maybe they just hired some different folks on staff. Ironically, everybody but me at Art of Coaching is female. I was in charge of men's and women's tennis, men's and women's golf, men's and women's swimming and diving, the cheerleaders, the dance team, all these things. But maybe this is their first time. What are 3 things they absolutely should not do, like day one? And you mentioned the music and what have you. Let's talk about almost that building rapport and getting to know them side of things. They're in front of them. Day one. Hey, ladies, I'm your coach. Blank. What are some things they should not do that you think are really counterproductive?
Well, one thing that I mentioned kind of earlier, and I'll come back to it because I really think it's applicable here, is when you're talking to female athletes, remember that they're already going to be really hard on themselves, probably much harder than most of the males that you're going to work with, just because that kind of goes back into that archetype a little bit, of being really self-conscious and already being an analytical personality type if they're in sports, and really wanting to please whoever they're working with. Like that's kind of, I think, a really common aspect that gets overlooked is that those little girls that you're working with, or young women, depending on what it is, they want to make you happy and they care about that a whole lot. And so if you speak to them in a way that, even if you don't mean it this way, but if you speak to them in a way where they think that you're not happy, or that they are disappointing you, or that they're not doing a good job, they just internalize that and they start beating themselves up. And so they're going to be harder on themselves, most likely, than you ever will be.
Hey, we're going to hit pause real quick and come right back to this episode. It's obvious from this conversation the importance of the fact that people don't just want a safe place to work, train, or live. They also want and need a safe place to connect, a place where you can be yourself, open up about struggles, questions, anything like that. And we've created that with the Art of Coaching All Access community. You can go to artofcoaching.com/channels. Again, that's artofcoaching.com/channels. And it's a way for us to connect it's not anchored to social media. It's not some big membership site. Literally every week we do different content drops we're not talking about anywhere else, open Q&As, and it is open to anybody of any experience level, any background whatsoever. If you want to be a better leader, a better communicator, and you have questions, you have struggles, and you want to connect with others to problem solve in a collaborative way, check it out. artofcoaching.com/channels. All right, back to Christina.
If you speak to them in a way that, even if you don't mean it this way, but if you speak to them in a way where they think that you're not happy, or that they are disappointing you, or that they're not doing a good job, they just internalize that and they start beating themselves up. And so they're going to be harder on themselves, most likely, than you ever will be. And I think that's something that you really have to remember when you're working with those people, because if you do come from a place of mostly cueing, mostly corrections, mostly kind of getting onto them, or coming on into that authoritarian kind of coaching style, then they're going to take that and internalize it even more. And it's going to become a thing where they're not good enough. They're not confident. They're going to lose what confidence they did have. And they're just going to keep kind of shrinking away, if you will, instead of coming out of their shell a little bit more, which is usually in sports what you want. You do want them to be a little more aggressive. You want them to play a little bigger. You want them to have confidence that they actually can squat whatever's on the bar, that kind of thing. And so I think that's probably the biggest one, is always speaking confidence into them, rather than feeling like you have to discipline them the same way that you might need to discipline like a group of unruly high school boys who are climbing on the squat racks. You're not going to see as much of that kind of behavior.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. I remember in 2019, there was an article that came up, and the article talked about intimidation, verbal abuse of Canada's elite athletes, and the fact that it's not uncommon, especially as it related to female athletes. And there's been a number of coaches sanctioned to this point. And so I think, I have to pull it up, but they talked about more than 1,000 athletes participated in this anonymous online survey, right? And they were talking, all of these athletes either currently or previously played on one of Canada's dozens of national teams and are over 16. And what they talked about is that even though so much has been rightly placed on the prevalence of sexual abuse in sports, and we certainly heard about that in gymnastics and what have you, the athletes in this study reported the far more common form of abuse at the national level is psychological. I mean, literally 1/5 of current national team members said they had been, received kind of like just psychological harm of these coaches using pressure tactics. And I want to be clear before I turn this over to you for sure, because you're the expert. I think we have to make a point that I'm a pretty rough around the edges coach, Christina, right? I talk frankly, matter of factly, but I also think I balance that with some warmth, but I speak frankly. I think people need to understand that we're not talking about not holding people accountable, helping them get the most out of themselves or whatever. There comes a line where, and this is a very scientific term, you cross the dipshit zone, where you have to ask yourself, am I trying to prove a point and really trying to help here? Or like, is something else leaking into my coaching? Is something else my desire for control, my desire for respect, my desire for predictability, my avoidance of risk and uncertainty and what have you, which I think a lot of these coaches have. And I'm using my as a collective metaphorical we, right? I'm asking that coach should think about that. Is that's what leaking into my coaching, or do I have a desire to make this athlete great? Any thoughts? I know that's just a broad thing, but I wanted to bring that up. Take that anywhere you want, your thoughts around psychological abuse with respect to these kinds of athletes.
No, that's an excellent topic. And I think, like you said, in gymnastics, but I think in women's sports in general, we've seen so much of that. And there's so many more athletes out there who haven't realized that that's happened to them yet. And I think that's almost worse, is that it felt so normal to be coached that way that they don't know it was wrong. And I can kind of relate to that personally a little bit. So, and I think this will be a good story to lead into a different topic, is my gymnastics coaches when I was younger were really good people with good intentions, who wanted the best for us. They really did. And unfortunately, the generation of gymnastics that I came up in and the people who were kind of at the top at that time were those verbally abusive and psychologically abusive coaches. And so they're the people that every other coach is looking up to and is seeing their success in terms of what kind of medals they're winning and how their girls are doing and that kind of thing. And that's who they're learning from. That's who's teaching the conferences. That's who's saying, this is normal. This is how you have to do it. This is how you make gymnasts successful. And so even though my coaches were not ever intentionally bad to us in any way, they always wanted the best for us and really did care about us. They didn't know any better. And so the things that they were getting passed down to them from these people who now we know were abusive to all their athletes. And sure, those athletes won medals, but like they're just broken people now, which is never should be the goal. It should never be worth it for someone to be an Olympian, but then have a terrible life after that, because of what you've done to them emotionally or psychologically and that kind of thing. And I think, like you said, things that were bleeding into that. And in the case of my personal coaches, I know that wasn't the case. And as they have learned better, they've done better, and they still coach today. And I see them and how differently they do things and how they learned from what they were doing wrong in the past. But unfortunately, I think they're the exception. And most people do let their ego get in the way. They do let their personal drive to be successful, or even to be seen as successful, which they take to be how many medals their kids win, how many kids do they get to the highest level, how many state championships, national championships, whatever it may be that they've got, versus how many athletes did they take from where they were, make them physically and mentally better than they were when they started, and send out of their program a better person, a more successful person, a more whole person. And I know in gymnastics for sure, and in a lot of women's sports, we've just heard so many stories about how it's the exact opposite, how They don't really care about the person. They care about what they do on the court, what they do on the field, what they do, on the mats for gymnastics and that kind of thing. And like you said, their ego's getting in the way. Their personal goals are getting in the way of what they're doing for those kids or even for adults. And kind of where I went back to at the beginning, like so many of those athletes get that kind of coaching as a kid, or as a young adult, or as a high schooler, or even into college, and they continue on to the elite level of sport, and they never get someone who shows them that it was wrong the whole time. And so then they take that into them when they get into romantic relationships, into friendships, and they get into abusive relationships and that kind of thing, because the way they were treated is how they think they're supposed to be treated. And they were never truly like valued by a coach. And I came out of gymnastics, and like I said, my coaches were good people with good intentions who had bad information. And I walked onto my college track team, and my first year of track, and I ran as a senior in high school, but it was like a really big team, and the coaches really kind of didn't get to know me, and I was self-taught. So coming into college, I had to completely relearn like everything I knew. And the coach that I had was incredibly patient with that. And I was doing high jump. So I have no height at it, like the first 3 meets I did. And I was the only high jumper that we had that year. So I was like, I've just completely let the team down. And what I had been taught up until that point was if I mess up, I am of no value to anyone, basically. And what I would do to myself was, because it was what I was used to with gymnastics, I would just walk away. Like I would go to the bathroom and cry. I would do it, but I would not do it in front of people. And I would come back and I would be a good teammate again. And I would never let in anyone to know that like I wasn't okay. And it was purely by luck that the bathroom was kind of far away and I had no height it again. And like, I didn't get to the bathroom before a tear started rolling down my face, and my coach saw it. And when I came back out, he sat down with me for probably 20 minutes and just kind of was telling me, like, it may take you until your senior year to finally like really be successful here, but I don't care. You're still valued. And I still think you're an important part of this team, no matter whether you make it over that bar or not in the meet. And I think that was the first time anybody had done that for me. And I was like, well, this is new and different. And I didn't know it could be like this. And so that was great for me personally, but it was a really transformative experience that I took with me into my own coaching, because now I go, oh, and I felt so much better after that I actually performed a whole lot better. I took a lot of pressure off of myself that if I didn't do well, I wasn't important. And I just started paying attention to like actually doing my best. And if I made it and I got into the meet and I scored points for the team, great. But if I didn't, it mattered to me. I still wanted to be successful, but it didn't matter in me beating myself up and telling myself I wasn't worth anything. And that kind of mentality, which, as you know, in performance usually just makes it worse. You just kind of start spiraling at that point. So I think that those two stark differences in coaching were just really big in me kind of taking that into my personal coaching and what I do now.
Yeah, well, I mean, to touch on that, and you mentioned a lot about, I want to think about where I want to jump on this, because there's so many great points. I don't want to forget one. You had mentioned that you feel like you had a non-traditional kind of entrance into coaching. And what ties into this is, think about everything you've said about athletes and the way we deal with athletes and the way that we want them to be achievement focused or what have you. Well, a lot of the reasons I think that these toxic coaches exists is we celebrate things that are tangible and highly visible, right? So these wins, these losses, like these, when people win championships and they have a great record, a lot is swept under the rug. A lot is swept under the rug because the sports industry is really the entertainment industry. So we've idolized a lot of these figures because, and it's the same thing. Listen, we dealt with it early on from a business standpoint, trying to sell coaches on becoming a better communicator. For some coaches, it's esoteric. They think they're good. And then they realize that they haven't had any socialization in communication training. They don't have any. And when you consider the fact that coaching in general in competitive sport or strength and conditioning tends to attract alpha level males who want to be dominant, they want to be able to, I say this all the time, a lot of strength coaches were average to above average athletes, highly competitive. The weight room was this place of solace. So they take that competitive, dominant, hyper insecure mindset into something and they project that onto the people that they lead. And so it's troubling to me and I've only realized this recently as I've expanded upon my own work, of all these coaches talking about how do I get across to athletes? How do I do this? And I'm like, some of you need to look at yourself, And the only reason I'll say it like that is because I had to do that. That was the only advantage that I had being hospitalized, at such a young age. You have nobody to talk to, nobody around. Like I have to sit and think. I had no social media distractions. You didn't get a phone. You didn't get anything in that hospital. You had to sit and think, and you were asked questions by psychologists and psychiatrists that made you dive in. And that was deep for me as a 15-year-old. But a lot of these coaches haven't done that. And so they're in these positions of tremendous power, it's almost like the parent that lives vicariously through their kid. That parent didn't get to do this or that. And so these coaches are protected, and then they don't ever feel like they have to work on the quote unquote soft skills because, hey, as long as they're winning, most of their athletes they don't feel like most of their athletes are ever going to speak up. And guess what, Christina, if they speak up, they're soft. They're not committed. It's easy to brush them to the side. So it sounds like you had this one coach that thankfully didn't make you feel like that. Yet the most of the world wouldn't know their name because, hey, they might not have won 80 championships.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So one really cool thing about my old track coach is a lot of the girls that I coach do two sports or something like that. And they learn to pole vault because it comes really naturally to a gymnast, and they tend to be really good at it pretty quickly. And so he teaches pole vaulting private lessons on the side. And a lot of the girls that I work with are working with him too. And that always just kind of makes me smile because I'm like, I know they're in good hands. I know that someone is teaching them that they're important, is actually taking the time to really get to know them and like be invested in their success, both personal and, actually pole vaulting. And he's a college coach. So, I mean, sure, he gets money from doing these private lessons, but those kids are not going to commit to his school.
Right.
Long term, there's not really anything in it for him other than just truly wanting to make sure that they are successful later on, whether they go somewhere else or whether they quit after high school or whatever it is. And so I think we need more coaches like that for sure. And one thing that you mentioned there with people not realizing that they're the problem, if you will, is I see that so much, especially in the sport of gymnastics. There just is this incredibly toxic, this is how we've always done it and this is how we have to keep doing it kind of culture. And you would think that all of the stories that have come out of USA Gymnastics in the last couple of years would be enough for people to go, hey, that didn't actually work. Maybe the team has been winning gold medals, but look at these 250 people who were sexually abused because they thought it was normal. And that's the worst part of that whole story, is that the reason that it didn't come out for so long was because those girls didn't know something was wrong. They didn't know they shouldn't have been treated like that. And that Larry Nassar worked in a gym where someone was so verbally and psychologically abusive to the girls that going to him felt like an escape. So that was something they were literally running away to. And then again, not realizing that something was wrong. And so it was literally a setup where someone was being so rude to them and they did know that they felt bad, that they went to someone who made them feel better and didn't realize that was also a form of abuse. And I think that those situations are unfortunately more common than we realize. And when all of that stuff came out, there were a whole lot of gymnastics coaches that I saw just all over social media talking about how crazy it was, how they couldn't believe that kind of stuff was happening. And this whole time I'm sitting there going, I can, because right now you guys are all blaming those people and none of you are going, have I ever made someone feel like they needed to go run to someone else?
Right.
And I see that, across the gym or in different programs, and I see those kids running to someone else, thankfully not in that same kind of situation, but just the fact that they feel like they need to escape, that they really respect their coach and they really want to be successful and want to make that person happy, but that they are willing to kind of like put things inside of them or try and find comfort in something else. And that shouldn't be the case. That shouldn't be something that a young athlete needs to do to be able to feel like they can stay in their sport and continue to train it to the best of their ability.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for those kinds of predators to hide in plain sight because, like you said, there are people that can take these advisor roles and these coaching roles because they know people are going to seek out help and a confidant and what have you. And the problem, what's crazy to me is it's so systemic and in many forms of leadership, not just coaching, but there are people that will know that individual that did wrong, yet they won't ever really take a stance or a side on it because they feel like they'll get blacklisted, right? And we've seen this in strength and conditioning. We've seen things happen in strength and conditioning where it's like I will witness people that I know in the field scared to say something, not because they didn't know oh, like, well, we don't know the facts yet. No, you know the facts. Like the facts are blatant, but it's really because they're nervous that if they speak out against that individual, somebody in their coaching circle will not allow them to get their next job. And it's like, yo, your next job is that important to you? Like your circle. And so I think people need to look at, I'd said something in a social media post recently. We look at what we eat. We look at sleeping. We look at these health behaviors. I think people really need to take a look at not only themselves, but their social circle. And again, I've had to do this plenty of times too. I've had to be like, are the people that I'm around really serving me in the capacity that they need to? And I don't mean serving like, are they benefiting me? It's, is this similar values still? Are these similar goals still? Do I really want to be associated? Because we all seek approval, right? And I found myself seeking approval from people who used to be, at the apotheosis of my career. And then I took a second guess and I'm like, yo, I don't want to be like that. And that's nothing against them. Maybe in that situation, it's just, I think taking a second to look at what we really want, who we really are, and who we really hang around would serve a lot of us some good.
Definitely. And I think just really being willing to take a look at yourself and how you're doing things and to truly analyze those things and be self-aware of how you might be affecting other people outside of just their sports performance. Like if sometimes I see so many red flags coming out of a program or something like that, just tons of kids getting burnt out, tons of kids constantly being hurt, tons of kids leaving on bad terms with their sport, and not quitting just because they outgrew it or because they didn't want to do it anymore or anything like that. And I think the worst part of that is when you see those coaches who continue to do the exact same thing. They don't change anything. Like they don't even realize that something is wrong, that they're having such a crazy attrition rate. Or kids who are getting injured to the point that their career is over and their entire sports career is over when they are in high school. And obviously there's risk associated with any kind of sport. I'm not saying that there should never be any kind of injury, but when you have an injury problem or when you have a burnout problem and these kids are not even to college yet, that's, I think, a big sign that you should do something different. And I see so many times where they push harder. They do the opposite. They go further in the direction they were already going instead of taking a big step back and going, all right, this isn't working. I have to do something different. Or we have to try something different. And I think some of it comes from, like we said earlier, control and wanting to be in control, and being kind of afraid that if they try something different, they're not going to be in control anymore. Or being afraid to be wrong and to try something new, being afraid of failure a little bit. And if you don't do those things, you're never going to truly progress and truly grow your program.
Yeah. And one thing with that you mentioned earlier that I want to bring up, and there is one more question I want to ask you after this, and I want to respect your time, but I think it's important that we do this, is if there's an athlete listening, because coaches will share this with athletes, managers will send this with it to employees. Is there a place, to your knowledge, that anybody that has dealt with some kind of sexual abuse or that kind of harassment that they can go? Is there a resource that they can reach out to? Because I know a lot of times it's like, oh, well, complain to HR or, go to the governing body or, go to this or go to that. But a lot of times these places can insulate, right, the person that perpetrates some of this stuff, and what should be secret and private and respected really isn't. Is there a unifying body or a council or any kind of safe place people can go to your knowledge, that can be helpful to them?
I think the biggest one that kind of is general for almost every sport right now is called Safe Sport. And it is, from the coaching side of things, there's some training that you go through, and it's pretty basic training.
I've been through it.
I would say most coaches should already know it. They probably already covered it from their organization, but some who are either working on their own or getting into it and they're new, some of it might be news, because some of it is very common sense, I think, but some of it is things that you might not think about. Like, you can't give an athlete a gift. And again, it's probably one of those things that in most cases is a good intention, but it just may not always be perceived the way that you want it to be, and that kind of thing. And so it has a training aspect, and it has a lot of sports governing bodies that require it of the people who are certified to coach within their organization. I know I have to do it for both gymnastics and for powerlifting to be allowed to coach, but it also has the opposite side of that, where it has a lot of resources for both parents and athletes who, if they think there is a problem, they can report it. And there's a way to report anonymously. There's a way to actually give all the details you have and give your name, especially if you're the person that is being harmed in some way so that they do know who it is. And they are supposed to keep you anonymous as much as possible. I do know sometimes when they get into formal investigations with law enforcement, they do have to give some details. And
Sure.
so,
Yeah. And I
but I
found
do
the
know
link. Go ahead.
they ask you first, at least. You know that that's going to get passed on to someone else at that point. But I think that's kind of one of the biggest ones because it does allow people, like I could report another coach through that and have an outside third party be in charge of the investigation rather than me going to my manager and saying, hey, this coach that I work for or work with is doing this. And then it kind of becoming a personal thing and somebody retaliating in some way and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, and everybody listening, we're going to link this, the website down below. It is uscenterforsafesport.org, and then there's a report a concern page, like Christina said. So we're going to have that linked. You can report online. You can call to report. Listen, I know you have to get going soon, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question because I know it's something you fight. And I know if you fight it, a ton of other people fight it. I've dealt with it in my own respect, but nowhere to the point that you have with you being female. And I want to frame up this context, right? A lot of times, and we have these questions from our audience. You're a female coach in a male dominated field, right? And that comes with sometimes being asked to be something that you're not. That can be being looked over, being discredited, to prove yourself. And where I said that I understand a little bit of this is when I left the team setting, to go into the private sector, or when I wrote a book on communication, there were some people that had never seen me coach or what have you that, oh, Mr. Coaching Authority, let's see you coach. I would literally have people that would contract me to give a talk. They'd switch it up and be like, oh, you're going to give an agility or a weightlifting practical. And then after that, they were like, oh, we just wanted to see if you could coach. We've never seen your work. And I'm like, and that's the way you went about it? You could have just asked me, And if I'm a guy and I dealt with that just because of my age or I wrote a book and a platform, what you deal with as a female is so much more amplified in many respects. Can you touch on any aspect of that you're comfortable of touching on and just how you've dealt with that frustration and how you've kind of created a strategy around it so that it's not just, no, I'm just going to get pissed and this isn't fair, but you've actually kind of beat them at their own game?
Yeah. So one thing that I wanted to mention at the very beginning of this is a lot of what I have experienced in terms of kind of being looked down upon for being a female coach comes from females. And that I think has been the most surprising part for me. Like I do get it from males, of course, as well. But some of my own managers and bosses and that kind of thing, actually almost every person I've ever worked for in a coaching setting has actually given me the feedback at some point that I should be more of something in every single one of the qualities with something that's generally seen as masculine, like louder, more in your face, more of the drill sergeant mentality, like just those kinds of critiques and feedback. And I think most people having just heard this would be able to tell, but anybody that knows me knows that that's just not my personality and it's not how I get through to people. And I do have more of a calmer, quieter kind of like personal approach to working with people and really getting in on that individual level and stopping and talking to people one-on-one when I'm giving them feedback rather than like yelling at a whole group. And I definitely don't get in people's faces. That just isn't who I am as a coach. And I know there are some really incredible female coaches out there who can do that and do it well. But expecting all of us to coach in that way, I think is really short-sighted. And on top of that, it's not what every single athlete needs. So the expectation that all of us need to coach the same way, regardless of gender, I think is also just really outdated and really just, it needs to go away. But I would say one way that I've kind of, I guess, proved myself a little bit is that I kind of ignored what people said and I didn't try and get louder and try and be something I wasn't. But I got through to athletes that used to be with someone else who was more of that kind of, I guess, traditional style of coach. And I got through to them when someone else couldn't. We've had breakthroughs, they've had more success, just different things like that in a sport that is mostly female dominated, like gymnastics. Being able to get through to those kids and to those young adults in that manner. But I think some of the biggest breakthroughs and the biggest times when someone else outside of it was able to go, oh, maybe she really does, have something going here, is when I have like my really big male powerlifters, my 275ers and my super heavies, and, my guys who are squatting 800 pounds and benching 600 and that kind of thing, and they are covered in tattoos and they're, your typical powerlifter stereotype, and they pick somebody who is quiet and calm to coach them on purpose. Like that's what they needed. And they knew that. And they are in a sport like powerlifting, which is kind of considered to be an angry sport, if you will. And you go to a meet and it's loud metal music playing, and it's a very like hyped up environment. And so they knew they were already getting that, and they needed somebody to bring them down. And I think that's a really cool thing for them to know. But also, the more other people saw that and saw me at meets and saw how successful those people were with that type of coaching, more people have come to me from a client perspective. But I think I've seen other coaches change their technique a little bit and kind of change how they approach things, and not always be up all the time, because sometimes that makes people more anxious and more, just kind of, it's too much arousal when they don't need it, when they really need to be trying to come down the other way. And so I think it's a little more obvious that people want that when you are working with a female athlete or you're working with a kid in a sport like gymnastics that is very concentration focused. Like you don't get up on a beam with loud music playing and cheering going on the whole time. You kind of want a quiet environment. So I think it was more obvious in that context, but it was when it came out in powerlifting with the people who are expected to be a completely opposite personality, that it really kind of got people to stop and look and be like, wait a minute, that's not what we expected, but it's working. And so I think for me, really kind of having to prove myself in a little bit of a, we didn't think she could do that, but she did kind of way, has been probably the biggest moment for me, and kind of turning that narrative around.
Yeah, well put. And I think you're somebody that, even just with how you carried yourself at the apprenticeship, that I hope I don't want to say I hope you want to do this. I hope you understand that you could and should. And I'm going to say that now. I'm going to put you in a kind of a circle here. I think that you're somebody that absolutely should speak to organizations in different fields about these things. I don't think there's enough of it. I do think that there is, and I'm biased with this, right, because of my own communication style. I think there's enough stuff out there about kind of leaning in and doing these things and what have you, and kind of taking this poignant but soft approach. I think that there's room for more matter-of-fact conversations about this. People that are not in your face, but they are frank. People from other populations. I think that it is 100% time for more in the coaching community to try to cross over and help organizations in other fields do this. Because here's one thing I know, right, from being able to speak at different organizations, nearly everybody watches sports. Everybody has well, not everybody, of course. A lot of people have kids that are going to participate in some forms of training, right? But we still don't see enough people that have worked on the training side, the strength and conditioning side, the performance side, going out and spreading these things. So I hope that in the many things that you do at some point, and if not, I want to encourage you to do it. I just think that you pursuing opportunities to speak for some of these organizations, and anybody listening, if you're a part of any kind of corporation or small business or what have you, I think you'd really value from having somebody like Christina in to speak and talk about these issues in a way that's bespoke to you and your organization, because she's certainly somebody that can. And yeah, I just want to kind of throw my support behind you in that way, because I think you'd be great at that.
Thank you. I've done a lot of work with some different universities, both my alma mater and then a couple of grad schools I worked with recently, where they have a strength and conditioning minor or something along those lines, and gotten a chance to guest lecture for them and kind of bring in that different perspective. I think that's a really good way to do it. And then I just made a point to get onto our state board for the NSCA here, so that I can especially help select speakers so that we are getting a more diverse, list of keynote speakers, especially in the state, and eventually hopefully at the higher level. Because like I said, I don't want them to pick a token female speaker every year and just, we need a girl, so here's one. Because there's so many incredible people out there to choose from, and sometimes people just don't know where to look. And I think really making sure that those people are kind of brought to the forefront, because we do need more different perspectives. We have all of those traditional coaches out there, and not to take away from what they've done for the industry, but there's always room for improvement, and it takes something different to make things grow sometimes.
Yep, absolutely. And guys, if this is stuff that fascinates you, please make sure to check back into previous episodes with Nikolai Morris, Jennifer Noyles, Nathan Parnham. This is something we go deep in often. Christina, know that if you ever want to create something evergreen, a mini course for Art of Coaching, we're always happy to give you a platform because we think that this stuff is needed, and I know our audience will want it. In the meantime, where can everybody go to support you directly? And we'll put it all in the show notes, so don't worry about spelling it. But where can they go to support you, your work, contact you, and help you out?
I think I'm the most active right now on Instagram and just trying to put out educational content, both on truly a strength and conditioning and an exercise physiology type perspective, but also on some different coaching and sports psychology and really getting through to people. Like last week, I literally put something together on how music affects your performance, and just kind of getting those kinds of things out there so that people have resources to adjust what they're doing and learn from that. And it's a really easy way to get in touch with me too. And I share a lot from other really good resources there. So my Instagram handle is Lift Heavy Princess, and then you can always contact me as well through my website, which is liftheavyprincess.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for your time. And thank you guys, as always, for listening. This has been Brett Bartholomew and Christina Myers for the Art of Coaching podcast. We'll see you again soon.